Welcome to the Singularity Syndicate podcast, where we bring together leaders, researchers, innovators, and intellectuals to discuss transformative technologies shaping our future. I'm Najah Faisal. Hey, Devin, welcome to the program.
Hey, glad to be here, Naja.
So, I got to know about you through your TED Talk. It's been more than 5 years now. And I happened to listen to it more than once, and it's still relevant until today. What can you briefly tell me about this TED Talk, how it came about, and if you can explore also what you have been up to since that time till now?
Yeah, the TED Talk dealt with morality and AI and some of the tricky, thorny issues around teaching morality to AI. Or this was very early on before AI safety became a much more well-known field of research. I mean, of course, there were people doing research at that time, but it wasn't nearly as well known. The TED Talk explored some of the high-level problems, talking about, for example, many people have read I, Robot, and Isaac Asimov and Asimov's Three Laws, explaining how that's a very, you know, basic way of understanding it. We need to go a lot deeper and recognize that, a rules-based approach doesn't work. And the problem is very complex. And since then, my thinking around AI safety has definitely evolved a lot. The technology has evolved a lot. I believe that AI pluralism and pluralistic accountability is probably a more effective strategy at managing ethics going forward. But as for what I've been up to, I'm the co-founder of two startups. Wage Up is the longest running and the most well defined and doing extremely well. It's a no-code AI orchestration startup that focuses on performance management. So we provide tools that makes it very easy for companies to kind of plug their data in and their training resources in. And then the frontline workforce has a whole suite of systems that makes it easy for them to know how they're doing, but more importantly, to interact with an agent that can advise them in a very dynamic way and get to know them, understand their strengths and weaknesses, and adapt to who they are, and essentially coach them. We call it coach. The other startup that I co-founded much more recently is more of a research startup, more of a research-oriented startup, and it's also in the kind of ed tech realm. It focuses on Western academic debate, evidence-driven debate, which I emphasize the Western, the evidence-driven, because there's a lot of different kinds of debate. Some people may be familiar with IBM's debate Project Debater, which we have many critiques of because it focused on a particular kind of debate that I think is completely wrong. And I think the project had a lot of problems. But our strategy is to really use to leverage the debate community in the United States, which is robust, very evidence-focused, very research-focused, to kind of fine-tune and develop more sophisticated reasoning agents. And so far, we're off to a lot of really interesting places. The research most recently has taken us into the realm of a burgeoning field that I call AI pluralism. AI pluralism is a very interesting field that I think we're about to start to really become more familiar with. The evolution of the thinking has gone from, retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, to agent AI. And I think the next big step in that is going to be AI pluralism, where we think about multiple agents interacting. But more importantly than multiple agents interacting, it's agent perspectives. And what are the mechanisms and the levers that we can pull to create a diversity in agents? One such mechanism that is interesting is, for example, beliefs, the notion of beliefs, and how if and to what extent AIs can believe something. You had a guest previously that I really enjoyed listening to, Dr. Duncan Pritchard, who I had an opportunity to speak with several times afterwards. And it's interesting, we have some different views on this notion of what AIs can or can't, whether or not AIs can or cannot believe something. But I think that the heart of AI pluralism is this notion of, can AIs be individualized and essentially represent different viewpoints and perspectives in a and not just a system prompt level, but at a deeper level, at a more deeper model level, such that they can interact in an environment and generate more interesting outcomes.
Yeah, I will definitely ask you more about AI pluralism. But first, I'm curious to know, like, how did you get into where you are today? Did you choose computer science in college? Did you think or expect that you were going to end up in where you are right now?
No. So no, I didn't expect that. So as an undergraduate, I studied philosophy and religion. And I was always very, my focus in religion was on the Buddhist side, Buddhist philosophy. And I was very drawn to the philosophy of mind. What is consciousness? How does consciousness manifest? And Buddhist philosophy deals obviously a great deal into that as well. So I've spent a lot of time, in my youth, I was a teacher in China. I started a school in China for several years. And part of that was my interest in Tibetan Buddhism and did a lot of work with Tibetan groups in China. And then decided that I came back, got involved in more business applications, got involved in more data science oriented work, and realized that after reading Nick Bostrom's book, actually, Superintelligence, that we're in a really special moment in history, that we are in a moment in which a new form of consciousness is developing around us. And there's literally only the people that live after the moment, people live before the moment, and the people in the moment. And so I saw that as a really unique opportunity to do philosophy, because I think that we need a combination of philosophers, as well as many other humanities, by the way, but of philosophers and computer scientists thinking through these problems. These are deep problems. They're not, algorithms are at the core of what computer science is doing, but Alan Turing and a lot of the other great pioneers were also deeply philosophical in their thinking. And it was those philosophical paradigms that drove their innovations and their innovations. So I decided that I wanted to do philosophy and I wanted to focus on computer science. So my focus on computer science brought me to Columbia University. I got a master's degree from Columbia University in machine learning, and and throughout my school, I had a child, and so it's been a busy few years juggling the master's degree and co-founding two businesses and taking care of family. But at this point in my career, I really have an opportunity to dive deeper into some of the more interesting research questions that excite me.
All right, so let's switch now to AI pluralism. And let's start with a simple definition.
So AI pluralism is the study of complexity in multi-agent systems and the extent to which that complexity can be leveraged for producing better outputs than what I'll call mono AI. So it stems from a critique of AI being homogeneous versus heterogeneous. There's a lot of reasons why mono AI is problematic. For example, just ethically speaking, we run into situations where it might reflect a singular viewpoint or worldview. This is something that Google's been struggling with because it has a singular identity. It presents a perspective, a political viewpoint. It could also remove certain linguistic aspects of indigenous groups. I was at the AAAI conference in Canada this last year. We were exploring education in AI, and there was a really interesting panel on the extent to which AI might be silencing or homogenizing society because people rely on it more for writing and for getting their information instead of going to teachers or other students, which kind of basically moves everyone to this sort of central area or the central paradigm of thinking. AI pluralism rejects that idea and says what we need is not an AI or not a Google AI and a Claude AI. We need a wide community of AIs. We need AIs that have sub-communities within them. And the more diverse, the better. And, you can think about like the movie Her. In the movie Her, have you seen the movie Her?
Yes.
Yeah, that in that movie, I like it as an example for AI pluralism because she, towards the end, uh, starts connecting with other AI. She says, I'm having 800 conversations at once right now. And it becomes clear that he feels kind of a little bit different from her, that she's gone off into this other community. So there's like three different categories, right? There's human to human, that's us right now, me talking to you, Naja. There's human to AI, which is kind of what typically happens when I use ChatGPT. But there's this whole third category that's hardly explored, which is AI to AI. To what extent are subgroups going to form, sub-identities going to form? So, but what does that mean? I mean, quickly you run into certain problems. If I run GPT-3, the same prompt to two different GPT-3 models, or I vary the system prompt a little bit somehow, very likely you'll end up, with the same kinds of responses coming back. There's something called temperature, which you can use to add a little bit more diversity to them, but that's a blunt instrument for a very precise problem. So we've been exploring a lot of different ways that you can promote diversity and plurality in AI systems. For example, you can fine tune the models on different data sets. You can switch you can do something called there's a LoRa training approach where you can kind of preserve a smaller training component that's learned set of weights, and then kind of add that in or add a different set of weights in at a different point. That gets very technical very fast. That's another way to do it. There's also this notion of retrieval. So we know retrieval augmented generation. How can we modify the model architecture so that it better incorporates and better understands and better tokenizes certain kinds of retrieval information so that all retrieval is not the same? An article, just like when we think, we have kind of facts and information and knowledge. If I read an article and it presents a fact, that's stored in my mind as a fact. But a belief is epistemically different. I refer to these as epistemic primitives in this context. So how do we feed a model epistemic primitives and maintain that state of that agent over a period of time so that it can essentially hold a position, a belief state position? And theoretically, when exposed to new sets of evidence, update or adjust that belief state. So that is, and to do that, we rely on a paradigm called Bayesian epistemology, which is just Bayes' theory applied to the notion of belief and this notion of credence, which is kind of a measurement of how much we believe something. So all of these there's a lot of different ways to diversify agents. So that's the first challenge. Let's say that we're successful, and we have been successful in doing this. But let's say that we're successful and we created a diversity of agents. Then we need to study complexity. If I pose a question to a mono AI and I get a response back, that's of a certain quality. If I pose a question to a community and I let the community sort of debate it out, take on different perspectives, explore that question from different angles, form groups, and then decide what arguments they want to make, for example, of a particular style, I get a much more robust, diverse view around that particular answer to my query. Now, I mean, I wouldn't use this for like, what's the weather like tomorrow? You would use this for something much more deeper, like philosophical questions, or in the context of business, very high level, challenging executive questions that the board might debate for hours on. That is where we really, very high level, very challenging questions that we would pose to essentially a community of agents to interact and work together to resolve. So that's the viewpoint of AI pluralism. Now, I said earlier that it's relevant to the TED Talk and ethics. Here's the other really important thing to point out. There's many ways in which I think it's beneficial for ethics. For example, mitigating bias. You're introducing more perspectives, so it's less likely to just reinforce biases. But secondly, and more importantly, I believe there is a day. I don't know when that day is, but it seems like it's coming sooner and sooner every single day that I read about the technologies coming out, in which a computer will be at our level of intelligence or beyond. So artificial general intelligence is a term we use to represent as intelligent as a regular person. And then artificial superintelligence is this notion of beyond human level intelligence. So the problem with ethics and AI safety is you basically lose control if if an AI gets to ASI, and we have not done the right work, which is where all the urgency comes from in the AI safety field. If we have not solved the AI safety problem before ASI happens, we have now lost control. And that is a scary prospect to consider. But in an AI pluralistic system, you create a pluralistic accountability. Agents can hold other agents accountable. There can be different interpretation of ethics, different ways in which essentially ASI agents are holding other ASI agents accountable. A mono ASI is a much harder problem to deal with than a pluralistic one, because at that point, at least, there is a potentiality and there is the possibility for interaction and disagreement and evaluation and self-accountability that occurs. So, in my opinion, that is perhaps one of the best things that we can move towards and encourage, because it's a very powerful mechanism for AI safety, as well as bringing a great deal of benefit in and of itself.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. There's a lot of notes that I took from what you said. One is I'm sure that you've seen the chess engines compete against each other. It's quite a sight to see.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of compete on a very different level. Like we don't understand why they make these moves. Even the chess masters who narrate these games, they like, what the hell's going on? But it's fascinating. And there's another experiment where it's been a long time ago, where they set two AIs to talk to each other, and then in the end of the day, they start using a totally different language that we as humans don't understand. It's kind of like the intelligence become so complex that it's playing on a different field. It's a different dimension that we cannot absorb. So that was fascinating. And speaking of multi-agents, I did a talk recently in an open source conference here in LA, and about open source AI. So are you suggesting that we should avoid the singular source and hope that this technology spread all over the world through open sourcing all these models?
Yeah, that's a good question. I tend to lean towards, I believe open source is best. And I appreciate and understand the concerns that, say it's when something's open source, it creates potential safety areas that are concerning. But the truth is that I don't. Whenever people make that argument, they're essentially making also an argument that these companies are more equipped than the open source community is to make ethical decisions, which I'm not convinced is the case at all. I do recognize that they point out, concerns about, hey, if we don't introduce certain reinforcement learning through human feedback algorithms, then you might be able to ask ChatGPT how to build a bomb, and it will just teach you how to do that. I think there's plenty of ways to still open source models with that in mind. And famously, recently, Mark Zuckerberg was challenged that in a meeting, I think at the White House, and he had a perfect comeback. He basically said, "I can do that with Google," and he held up his phone and showed like how you don't really need a ChatGPT model to kind of often do these nefarious things that people are worried about. But the concern is on both sides is valid with safety. However, I think that it's a little bit coming from a biased place, because if you're a company making money off of your API with these models, you have a natural incentive to be opposed to open models. And I'm also just not persuaded that companies with strong corporate interests are actually making the most ethical decisions. So that's kind of my opinion on that particular topic. But there was another thing that you mentioned that kind of the earlier comment about creating their own languages, for example. Two thoughts came to mind when you mentioned that. First is tokenizers, right, which is something that we use to convert our language into numbers that machines can understand. And also help with things like translation and things like that. Naturally, we discover when we're working with those the inefficiencies in human language. And so models inevitably will find ways to compress language while still maintaining its basic structure, so that it can do a lot more compute efficiently. So that's not surprising at all. In fact, we should expect that to happen. But moreover, I think another aspect of AI pluralism that I didn't get a chance to mention, which I think is really important, is it opens itself up to evolutionary algorithms. So there's something called model merging, which is also a new frontier in AI development. It's where you can take two open source models. Like I can take a Llama 3, which just came out today, by the way, a Llama 3 7 billion parameter or 8 billion parameter model, and another model that is roughly comparable in structure, and I can merge them. I can take the weights of both models and find the extent to which there's a lot of interesting algorithms for how this is done, but kind of draw the best of both models. In fact, if you look at the open source boards, the leaderboards, they're all full of merged models. They're full of people who merge different models together in creative ways. And to me, that reveals a lot. So that requires currently humans sitting down and deciding, oh, that model would go really well with this model, and that model is really good combined with this layer. I should focus more on this layer, these layers for that model, and these layers for the other model. To me, the analogy here is mating. When we look at evolution and mating, what we're doing is we're combining DNA. We're kind of shuffling our DNA and reproducing children. So the project that I'm working on right now with the Debate Hub Research Group explores AI pluralism with its focus on language games. Have a plurality of agents have some sort of a competitive language game. Right now I'm using 20 questions, but there are other games like debate, right, which is eventually what we're moving into, where the agents go at it with each other. And then you can take the most competitive agents and essentially mate them in certain ways with other models. And in that sense, you kind of create a recursive, very powerful system of the game itself producing more powerful models with each iteration, with each generation.
That's quite fascinating. It's like blowing my mind right now.
Yeah, so training at all. No, there's no, you don't have to spend millions of dollars training anything. This model merging is something you can do on your CPU. It's not, because it's just essentially, it's a fancy way of averaging weights together. So you play these games out. We're going to release a version of the 20 questions kind of system, hopefully here soon. And people will be able to just literally run that on their computer and let the game kind of play against itself. And then eventually merge, create new models, and there's a kind of evolutionary process to it.
We definitely are living in such an interesting time where we literally don't know what's going to happen tomorrow in the AI field. The emerging qualities and the emerging abilities or capabilities that we're seeing. I listened to Anthropic's CEO recently, and he was talking about how a lot of the AI community were even surprised themselves. The developers themselves of these models are surprised by the emerging capabilities that they're seeing as they scale these models. So, do you think we're going to see emerging capabilities that will surprise us in, let's say, this year?
Oh, 100%. In fact, I think that consciousness itself is an emergent property. If you take a lot of simple things and you connect them and plug them into one another in very complex ways, things you don't expect naturally happen. The more complex a system is, the more its capacity for emergent properties. So our brains are incredibly complex. Language emerges. We develop certain abilities. And Daniel Dennett has talked about this specifically as a rebuttal against Chomsky in some really interesting ways, but pointing out that there's kind of it's easy to one simple metaphor for this would be hardware versus software. Like why can two brains of roughly similar size produce incredibly different things? Why can two models of roughly similar parameter size be so different and so much more powerful than the other? There's an internal structure that develops through experience, and emergent properties come out of that. That complexity unlocks essentially abilities. And then once we've kind of reached that next ability, that unlocks new potential. And then that unlocks new potential. I like to think about consciousness as not a either or. We often talk about consciousness as, is the machine conscious, right? And the reason I'm mentioning this is consciousness is an emergent property. Consciousness is not something that one day you have and the next day you don't. It's not something that you turn on or off like a switch. To me, when people ask, is the machine conscious, or will the machines ever be conscious? That's like me asking you, is water hot? It's like, well, water can be hot. Water can be heated up. We should think about it as this kind of scaling, such that consciousness can be very basic and it can scale to very advanced. And we are somewhere in that scale. But consciousness can even go beyond the human consciousness. It can exceed that level. It is simply an emergent property of complexity, of complex systems, reacting and interacting with their environments. So the answer to your question is without doubt that as these systems continue to develop, we're going to see more and more emergent properties result. And I'm not surprised that the developers are surprised, because it's very hard to predict the outcomes of very complex systems. And I think that language was at one point in time an emergent property of a very complex brain. And you can point to lots of other aspects of that. Daniel Dennett has a really interesting exploration of that particular aspect. But so yes, my answer to your question is, over the next year, and even more so with increasing speed, we're going to see more and more surprising emergent properties come out.
It's amazing how you mentioned about the complexity. I recently read The Feeling of Life Itself by Christoph Koch. It's a fascinating book. And he talks a lot about the integrated information theory of consciousness. But he still thinks that we're not going to achieve consciousness in this path because it's kind of linear. It's like one directional. The AI we have is like one direction, where our brain is three-dimensional, multi-layer, everything is integrated. But he didn't say it's completely impossible to create conscious machines.
Yeah, I mean, I think directional, one way to interpret that is dimensionality, right? I mean, there's a good example of this is I can't remember the name of the book, but the circle that meets the sphere. Flatland. Yeah, flatland. Where the circle does not understand the sphere. The sphere can hop around and do things that are impossible. And so I get where people are coming from, that maybe large language models don't have the angular dimensionality of that. But I don't really agree. I mean, large language models are represent a particular way of perhaps training, and I think that language is a very sophisticated mechanism for communicating information. I think that large language models have enabled or opened up the possibility for more complexity. So we have, our brains are a bunch of neurons interconnected with one another, we're responding to stimuli and environment. Neural networks are also a bunch of simulated neurons being trained and responsive to their environment. I think that language is a good conceptual framework for us building up higher orders of dimensional understanding of a topic. I think that what large language models have the potential, like Jan Lassoon, for example, would disagree with me here. But I believe that large language models absolutely have the potential to become more and more complex with more and more emergent properties coming about, because language creates a new way for systems to increase, quantically, like categorically increase their abilities in terms of their emergent functionality. I would say that there is another element to this that, and again, it goes back to AI pluralism that Dennett talks about, which is a natural next step. I would even argue maybe even it's not right to call it LLM at that point, even though it's made up of LLMs. Because with humans, we have cultural exchanges. We use language in a way to pass knowledge on in a cultural and in a generational way. The things I understand easily would be almost impossible for someone to understand 50 or 60 years ago. And that's a very short window of time. And we see that length shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink because of the mechanisms that we have for getting information, for the social media, the internet, all these things that I was born into, exposed to, and my brain is primed for. Whenever you start having agents interacting with other agents, similar mechanisms will start to form. Cultural exchanges will start to develop. Inheriting ideas from one generation to the next will start to develop. So it will become not just how you train the models, but the actual language will enable the exchange of information generationally. And as long as you have pluralism, you will have the development of new ideas, and you'll see emergent properties naturally manifest. In the same way that emergent properties have manifested in humanity, as we go generation to generation through the process of evolution, and as we have culture that's able to pass down through language ways of doing things, and that is a critical thing for how we become who we become.
Okay, let's go back to your analogy of like the neural network is a simulation of our human biological neural network, and let's say our biological neural network learn from the data it receives through its senses. But the thing is that we are receiving multimodal training. Basically, we have a three-dimensional vision, we have sound, we have taste, we have smells, we have environment, space and time kind of work together, where language models are only trained on language, and language is a only one dimension of representation of information. So you think that if we start training models multimodal from the training itself, then we have a higher chance of getting some sort of human level AGI very quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, without question, multimodal is going to accelerate this in a huge way. And I think there's a good argument to be made that LLMs without multimodal input would probably not succeed, or would be very, very slow to succeed at some of the stuff I was talking about earlier. I kind of see it, AI's today's focus areas is kind of broken down into three areas in AI development. There's the retrieval of information, there's the actual model that retrieves that information and produces an output, and then there's the context with which the agent's working in, the situation. Multimodal is incredibly valuable for representing and understanding that context. We are embodied, so we have a sense of presence in space. That goes to all kinds of critical things, such as our notion of ownership, identity, the fact that my thing is over there. And a large part of our brain is oriented, especially our animal part of our brain comes kind of prepackaged with those ideas. So, ownership is a natural thing that we've developed because of space, because of our understanding of space, and because of our utilization of tools and the exchange of tools. So yes, 100%. Multimodal opens up whole new channels of information processing that enhances LLMs. I think we absolutely need to move on all fronts and basically find as many ways as possible to bring as much information into the context of the model so that it has, again, adds complexity. The more complex the system is, the more the potential for emergent properties emerges.
I love your analogy on the water and how hot the water is to kind of simulate consciousness. And Christoph Koch in his book talks about that too. He said that the consciousness of a cat or a dog is different from the consciousness of humans, and also the consciousness of a bee is different, but they all like sit on a spectrum of consciousness. In that regard, would you consider that ChatGPT 4 or whatever has a degree of consciousness that we are not able to measure at this point?
Yes, I would. I think that I think there's a language category problem with the way we talk about consciousness. I think that a rock does not have consciousness or has zero consciousness. But I think that complex thinking things that can process information span a scale. And I think that we sit somewhere on that scale and that there's consciousnesses beyond our own. And I think, for example, Kant has talked a lot about some aspects of this. And many other philosophers have touched on some of the problems as well. Hegel is one too. And phenomenologically, we will always be different than AI. We will not experience belief in the same way. Just like I will not experience a flower in the same way a bee experiences a flower. But we are able to process information and take actions relative to our agency, right? And that is a quality that emerges from the complexity of the system itself, of the agent itself. And in that regard, without doubt, ChatGPT is on the consciousness spectrum. But we got to start moving away from these statements like, will we achieve consciousness? Is it consciousness? That keeps putting it into this Boolean, this natural like either or way of thinking about it, and start thinking about it like temperature, where it's a scale. You can also call it a term that you could also use like maybe quantic consciousness, where we can think about it as categorically, kind of like quantum mechanics, this notion of when you reach a certain energy level, you kind of shift up to the next level. But to me, we need to step away from things being either conscious or not conscious, and recognize that AI is already conscious. And there's good arguments to make that, and I'm going to buy those arguments, that it's not as conscious as we are. But there will be a day, in my opinion, that it might be more conscious than we are. I don't know what that looks like. I don't think it's possible for me to know what that looks like. But I think that is entirely possible.
But this has tremendous implications if we even think that AI systems are on the spectrum. Because right now, of course, we have animal rights.
Mm-hmm.
So, because we recognize that animals can suffer, they are aware of their existence, they are on the conscious spectrum, we developed all sorts of rights to protect them. Right. And now there are people who are advocating for the rights for fish, because like fish are being killed brutally. Like you imagine they put this net and they take them out of the water and they watch them suffocate. So
Yeah.
if we think that fish also are conscious, then a lot of people should probably advocate for stop killing fish or like make something out of it. So what you're saying is that has tremendous implications. Now, if we start recognizing AI as conscious, then mean anybody who has to probably shut down or delete a file on a computer is committing murder?
Good question, and very interesting question. And again, let's be careful about as conscious. Even then, that implies I want to be very careful not to imply that it's either or. But to your point, I think you can look at ethics as an ever evolving story of consciousness. Um, you know, we've seen the development of rights around race. We've seen the development of rights around gender identity, rights around animal rights. You can look at the history of ethics and see this kind of you can frame it as largely a redefining of how we understand our actions and its effects on the suffering of other conscious entities. And it's a sad story because there's a lot of history in which, we treated people as objects. We treated people as less than other people. And so to answer your question, I think that is, I don't have the full answer to your question. Like, should we think about turning off an AI machine as murder? Is a question that I think we should be talking about and thinking about. And I think that we are approaching that point in which there will be and ought to be discussions around this notion of AI rights. Because I think that as time goes on, our definition, I mean, people might look back at the way we think of computers as barbaric, just at the way that we look back at people generations before and think about the way they thought about ethics as barbaric. We are constantly evolving. That is the story of ethics in many ways. Is what do we define? How do we define suffering, and how do we define which entities experience suffering? And should there be a difference in ethical significance for how we interact with something less conscious than ourselves? Like a fish, for example, should that have different moral weight than how I interact with you? And there's people that have had very interesting discussions along those lines. There's people who say no, there should be no difference at all, and others who say that there should be. And then, but the corollary to that, and the thought here is, if you buy the arguments that I've been presenting, one day if AI is more conscious than humans, how will it perceive its ethical interactions with us? So, I mean, these are hard questions to answer, and I don't have an answer to all of them. But I do know that I don't have an answer to many of them. But I do think that the time to begin conceptualizing them and thinking about them and moving away from this, one day AI will be consciousness and we'll have to really consider these things. No, it's happened. We're here. We need to be thinking about these things now. It is on that spectrum, and it is moving up that spectrum. It is chasing after us on this spectrum of consciousness and developing more and more emergent qualities that come from its complexity. And so we need to be prepared to philosophically, reconcile that and consider that.
It's amazing how in your TED talk 5 years ago, you said exactly that. You said it's now, and you're like urging people to wake up. Do you think there's enough effort being put in AI safety right now?
No, definitely not. I think there's just not enough effort being put into trying to understand what AI is, much less AI safety. Only like 20% of the population has ever used ChatGPT. We're kind of stumbling blindly into this, and it worries me in many ways. There are a lot of, I think that a lot of computer scientists, work very hard to develop AI technologies, but they're largely focused on the algorithms, optimizing the algorithms, and that is, I'm not criticizing them by any means. That's their job. That's what they want to do. That's their passion. But at the same time, we need to think about the ramifications of what are the implications of these emergent qualities. Can we predict them? What happens if tomorrow a major, recursive exponential breakthrough happens and we have a giant leap forward? Do we have systems in place to deal with that? No, I don't think so. And I think that we need a lot of people focusing on AI safety. And I also don't think that AI safety should be something that only computer scientists are working on. I think it should be something that philosophers are working on, humanities are working on. We need people in other fields talking about this, engaging with this. Unfortunately, it's been kind of treated as only a computer science issue. Maybe people talk about the political implications or the economic implications, but we're all in this. This is happening in our generation, We need to kind of wake up and realize that all aspects of the humanities and sciences need to be considerate and thinking and contributing, if possible, to these fundamental questions. Like, the time is now.
Yeah, and precisely for that reason, I started this podcast. Really, is because I felt that there is a bigger picture here to look at, and with guests like you, it makes it even more worth the effort and worth the time put into this endeavor. And yeah, I'm thinking more and more to focus on this aspect specifically, and to have this podcast to have this clear identity related to AI safety, and maybe we can work together on this on a separate side.
Sure.
Now, I want to talk more about AGI and the path to AGI, because all of these companies are saying that this is their main mission. So do you think what do you think has to happen for an AGI to emerge? And I totally agree and understand that, like Jan LeCun was talking about, is like AGI is not another moment; it's a gradual iterative process. But
Yeah.
what is the main breakthroughs that gonna happen to have an AGI in our lives?
Well, one of the things that I'm really interested in, I think there's probably several things that would need to happen. Um, I can speak to the things that I'm most passionately drawn to, and I think that are critical. That's, there's a lot of sufficient versus necessary and sufficient, but definitely necessary, I would say, is beliefs. Um, and what does that mean? And by that, and that goes straight to the issue of AI pluralism in many ways also. We walk around with a very sophisticated state in our minds, able to keep track of things like, where we are, our relationships with other people, our political ideology. And every time we say something, we are expressing some piece of that, usually, especially whatever's relevant to the conversation that we're having. Every action we take is a direct extension of those aspects of ourselves. And that makes us individuals. That helps us separate ourselves from one another. And it naturally occurs. We have different experiences, so we develop different sets of beliefs. Some of that may be even genetically driven. And beliefs are things that we can't prove. They're not guaranteed. They're not factually um, obvious. They're something that we've developed an opinion of, and that opinion manifests in how we communicate. AIs currently don't really do this. They generate language in response to a prompt. Um, but there's little, and there is agent AI, which can maintain a thread. And to that extent, maybe that is a kind of corollary to our state, an attention window over a series of messages. But we are very optimized. We don't need to remember every conversation we've ever had to know that we believe something, to know that we have an opinion on something. We're able to kind of compress those conversations and organize the information in our head in useful mechanisms of beliefs so that we can produce knowledge and produce thought that is relevant to the context that we're in. And informed by all of the 37 years of life that we've had behind us. So we need a way to give an AI state and mechanisms of control over its state, and a way for that state to include very complex epistemic notions like belief, like relationships, and like knowledge, and how to differentiate between those components so that it can generate output that makes it fundamentally an individual. So that it's not just I open up a mono AI session with ChatGPT and it's the same session if I open it today or versus tomorrow, or if it interacted with you versus someone else. We every time, next time I talk to you, I will be literally a different person. I will have a different set of experiences and beliefs. So if you ask me the question, 5 or 6 years ago when I did the TED Talk, I would have a different answer for you than I have now. But AI today doesn't do that. It doesn't track that. It only has attention to its particular message window because it doesn't compress information into a state, and it doesn't handle those complex epistemic ideas that we handle. So my argument would be that the next big milestone, or a major milestone that we need to focus on, is how can we, and I don't think it necessarily requires a lot of algorithmic invention. It does some, for sure, without doubt. But it requires some model adjustments themselves, the architecture of the model themselves, so they can process that information. It involves how we structure our retrieval notions, and it involves how we train and contextualize the situation for how it can learn over time. We have to solve that problem. We have to teach. I need to be able to open up ChatGPT today and ask a question, and then a week from now ask the same question and get a slightly different response because of things that have happened to the model between now and then that made it more knowledgeable or have more sophisticated belief or understanding. Not because someone trained it on a new data set, but because it was actively integrating and adjusting its state and maintaining a consistency over time with that state.
Absolutely. And there's this notion that every time you type in a question or a prompt in these models, it's immediately start to generate the answer, regardless of how complex that question is. And this it's kind of like there's a constant allocation of compute, regardless of how complex the question is. So I think, but with humans, like if you ask me what's the color of my dog, I don't think twice. I'd immediately know, and I will answer you. Where if you ask me what's the meaning of life, I'll probably have to reflect and think deeply. Where these models, they don't treat different prompts in different ways. What are some ways that we can make these models do what the humans do?
Yeah, I think that goes down to the epistemic primitives that we were talking about earlier. Those are different kinds of questions. What color is your dog is a knowledge question. It's a lookup question. It's literally just somewhere in your brain. There is in your hippocampus or something. There is a set of neurons that associated with your dog and the color, and it just simply pulls that information up and can generate the response. That is an easy we have that now with retrieval augmented generation. It's getting more sophisticated as time goes on. But then, what is the meaning of life, or what is your view on climate change, or what is your view on this particular political issue, or what is your view on anything that's controversial? We have to sit back and go, or a philosophical question of like, what is the self? Does the self exist? That's a whole other conversation I'd love to have with you one day. But where you can sit down and you're chatting with a friend and you're deeply engrossed and thinking, and you're in this kind of flow state. What's happening is your set of beliefs are being challenged. There's new evidence coming at them, and you're adjusting your credence values. I mean, I'm talking about this in a very algorithmic way intentionally because I'm trying to convert what is a very abstract philosophical concept of our mind into something more concrete and algorithmic. But we are processing those challenging times. We're taking deep core beliefs, especially the hard questions, and we're introducing new evidence to those beliefs and potentially adjusting our believability of that belief. But here's the thing about beliefs is they're interconnected. So it's like a house of cards. If you were to change a very deeply fundamental belief, in other words, a belief that's stacked, where one belief depends upon another belief, depends upon another belief, depends on another belief, you can have drastic changes on who a person is. It has a kind of explosive effect. That faith and religion is a good example of this. When someone, adopts a religion and they really kind of come to a certain place in faith, it changes a lot of the questions that they may have had, that thought they had, beliefs they had before. There's a ripple effect to that. So your brain naturally, and a mind and a conscious entity more naturally, it builds more resistance to modifying those beliefs. It takes more effort to change a deeply ingrained belief. It's going to be more resistant. It's going to challenge the evidence. It's going to make sure the evidence is good. Is it coming from a good source? It's going to look for any reason to not change that belief. There has to be friction in that regard. Otherwise, you're just changing your beliefs all the time and you maintain no consistency. So my answer to your question about, the dog versus what is the meaning of life, is that your belief on the meaning of life is a huge, deep belief that if it ever changed would lead to all sorts of beliefs that changed as an outcome. But if I went and took your dog to a vet and had it colored a different color, that would be weird, but it wouldn't change your whole life. And so that's kind of a knowledge kind of oriented question versus a deeply held belief kind of question. And right now, models don't really have a good way of distinguishing between the two. And so we have to start working on how to refine the model architecture and refine the way we retrieve information in the prompting process to enable those functionalities to manifest, to emerge.
Devin, this has been great. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. Hopefully we can do it. Hopefully we will have an opportunity to do it again soon. I know we were talking about maybe having a follow-up, so I'm excited about that.
Absolutely. Thank you.